Thank you so much for the invitation and for the organization of the 2026 Irigaray Circle Conference titled Liveable Futures at Newcastle. My presentation today is titled Thinking with Luz Irigaray, Elemental Poetics in Architecture. The Tower and the Elements. In the Roman Agora of Athens, the neighborhood that is nowadays known as Plaga, a modest octagonal marble tower, the Tower of the Winds, stands as an enigmatic structure. Built by Andronikos of Kyros around 100 BC, the tower presents a place that incarnates all three parts of the Vitruvian definition of architecture. It is a building, edificatio. It houses at least 8 planar sundials, gnomonica, and above all, it is a machine, machinatio. According to architectural theorist Bernard Cash, the tower is a machine that informs before it is a shelter. It is an instrument that lets architecture emerge, in other words, as a form of knowledge that resists mastery. And I would add, by thinking with Irigaray, architecture as an art of elemental cultivation. This presentation brings the Tower of the Winds into constellation with another body of thought that acts in a similar way. The elemental philosophy of Luz Irigaray. Across her writings on air, water, earth, and fire, Irigaray develops what might be called an elemental thinking, a mode of thought in which elements are not just inert backdrops to human action, but in fact primordial mediums through which a self finds a communion with the world and with the other. The elemental in Irigaray's texts supports the blossoming of the self into difference while letting it remain itself, a becoming in faithfulness to oneself and to the other. She writes, "This process is operational rather than representational, fostering a becoming, a being that does not divide itself from nature, but rather exists in communion with it." Thinking with the elements becomes a source of cosmic connection, spiritual resonance, and sexual difference, an awakening of architecture's poetic qualities, and a reaching toward what is the most real in the real, a real that we do not yet know because our culture has been busy with something other than our being and the relation between us, as Irigaray reminds us. The organizing analogy of this presentation is therefore the following. The Tower of the Winds stands to architecture as the elements stand to Irigarayan philosophy. I approach both the tower and the elements as instruments for building, dwelling, thinking, and desiring. At the core of both lies the question of how architecture can create conditions for those four operations to flourish, and of approaching architecture through a renewed relation to building, as an art of elemental cultivation. Part 1. Time passes. As the first construction described in Vitruvius' treatise on architecture, the tower stands at the beginning of an architectural tradition that has too often been reduced to the design of buildings. In fact, the tower was not just a building. It was also a clock, a weather station, an astronomical display, and a hydraulic mechanism, all housed within an octagonal plan that concentrated the 5 geometrical propositions of Thales, which were also central to the inauguration of a city. The tower's geometry enacts the very operation of inauguration, the division of the circle into 4 parts, repeated to produce the 8 winds that give the building its name. Vitruvius gives precise instructions for this procedure. Fix a marble slab at ground level, erect a bronze gnomon, mark the shadow cast, describe a circle from the central point, watch the shadow until it again touches the circle, and bisect the angles to divide the circle into 4. But the reading of the tower by Bernard Cash goes further than identifying the tower's geometrical origins. He insists that the tower was also a machine, not in Le Corbusier's sense a machine to inhabit, but in fact a machine to inform. In other words, an early computer designed to measure and display data. More specifically, the building included a bronze weather vane embodied in the shape of Triton at the top of its roof, a large water clock, also known as clepsydra, which literally means water thief, and finally 9 sundials on its 8 sides, plus the apse. In addition to all those devices, it is assumed that at the center of the building stood a spherical structure, a sort of celestial globe, also known as an armillary sphere, on which the movements of the planets and other celestial phenomena were illustrated on several rings. All those devices, choreographed several movements within one building: the wind through the rotation of the vane, the water and the planets through the rotation of the clepsydra, the sun through the traces of the light on the building's walls. The water clock mechanism in particular was remarkably sophisticated. Water from the clepsydra spring entered an upper reservoir in the cylindrical tower, maintaining a constant head through an overflow system. From this reservoir, water flowed at a regulated rate into a lower cylinder containing a float. As the float rose, it turned a large bronze disc engraved with a celestial map in stereographic projection, an anaphoric clock that simulated the apparent motion of the heavens. The disc, like the sundials on the tower's exterior, showed the seasonal hours through a grid of curved wires. The tower worked as an apparatus that processes data and exemplified how architecture is capable of translation between different domains. It staged a theatrical mimesis of a cosmos in constant change, a wonder to be admired rather than a practical device for telling time. Part 2. How does the gnomon think? To understand how the tower operates as an instrument of thought, we will now attend to its central figures, the gnomons that it houses. In its strict mathematical sense, the gnomon is the increment added to a figure that grows it into a larger figure self-similar to the first. But Michel Serres, in his reading of the gnomon, insists on something that the merely geometrical account tends to obscure: the material agency of the instrument. The gnomon is not merely a geometric abstraction. It is a physical object that operates independently of human intention. In other words, it operates autonomously. The tower, as a building populated by those physical instruments, has the capacity to generate knowledge through its own operations. The gnomon is an artifact that never ceases to be an artifact, as Serres writes. It functions relentlessly, whether or not a human agent is present to interpret its operations. What makes the gnomon an instrument of thought is precisely this operational nature, and this has profound implications for architecture. What is at stake here is not the thought of an individual. Serres is explicit that the gnomon affords knowing in the sense of a mechanical machine for knowledge, not in the sense of an individual subject organized into the generic faculties of memory, imagination, and reasoning. Its knowledge is objective rather than subjective, nor is this reasoning autonomous in the sense of self-sufficient. Serres insists that automatic reason always comes paired with a mnemotechnics, a hardware that depends on its software, so that what the gnomon generates must still be recorded, tabulated, and carried forward by other means. And the intelligence at work is not, strictly speaking, localized in the instrument at all. Serres locates it in the world itself, immanent and no doubt coextensive with the universe, with the gnomon serving as the site where this immanent intelligence becomes legible. If architecture then is understood as an instrument in this sense, buildings are not merely passive objects that we interpret or use. They are active and have the capacity to generate knowledge through their own operations. The gnomon is not a representation of a pre-existing form, but an apparatus that lets form emerge through its own operations. It is an instrument that thinks only in this displaced sense, not because it contains thoughts, but because it is the point at which the world's own automatic reasoning becomes operative and legible. The Tower of the Winds, read through this gnomonic lens, does not represent the cosmos. It works rather as an instrument that generates cosmological knowledge through its geometry, its hydraulics, and its astronomical displays. Part 3. The elemental sustains an interval of communion. In the case of the tower, the elements set in motion a set of measuring and cosmological devices. The building performs with the elements, orchestrating a relational system between space, time, and natural forces. In the case of Luz Irigaray, the elements perform nuptials in a similar way. Across her elemental writings, air, water, earth, and fire are never just a backdrop to her story. They're the primordial mediums through which a self is in communion with the world and with the other. The elemental is added to a self to let it grow into difference while allowing it to remain itself. Irigaray's elemental philosophy unfolds perhaps most explicitly in her elemental works such as Everyday Prayers, Marine Lover, Elemental Passions, The Forgetting of Air in Martin Heidegger, Sharing the Fire, or most recently the book Through Vegetal Being. In her text Divine Women, She explains how she was anxious to go back to those natural matters that constitute the origin of our bodies, of our life, of our environment, and the flesh of our passions. In her introduction to an ethics of sexual difference, Irigaray situates the question of sexual difference as the threshold of a new age. As she writes, it is one of the important philosophical questions of our age, if not one that we must address first. This address perhaps requires a different mode of thinking, one that attends to the elements. They become, in a sense, the building blocks for an encounter with the other, for the entanglement of micro and macrocosm, and for a cultivation that is at once vertical and horizontal. In her preface to Everyday Prayers, this elemental thinking is described as a reconstitution of the continuity between nature and ourselves, the dialogue with nature, of the need to find other perceptions, other gestures, other words to say and to speak between us, the relations to nature, to ourselves, and to the other. Irigaray does not call for a return to nature as an object of contemplation, but a recovery of nature as a medium of encounter. Air in Irigaray's account is the element that has the closest relation to being in its different manifestations. Air belongs to the universe, but also to the human living, in which it operates a secret alchemy, a possible transubstantiation from body to soul, she writes. Body and soul are not opposed, but continuous. Soul then remains matter, but a matter more fluid or of a different consistency and density than that of the breath we need to survive. The element of air is what mediates this continuity, the gnomon that weds body and soul. For Irigaray, breath is the element of speech, of the pneuma that animates the living body. The wind is the world's breath. The tower, by making wind visible and directional, turns the invisible respiration of the cosmos into a public, shared orientation. Citizens could see which wind was blowing, not as a weather report, but as a felt relation to the sky. Water in Irigaray's writing is the element of birth and of the feminine. It is the medium of the mother-child relation, the primordial interval that makes separation possible while maintaining connection, the fluid that resists the rigid geometries of the same. The Tower of the Winds, with its water clock fed from a spring on the Acropolis, is also a building that accommodates the flow of water, a building that thinks through water, that uses water's flow to generate knowledge about the cosmos. By enacting the passage of time, the stealing of time, as the word clepsydra connotes, the building becomes a participant, not just a mere resource, to the living, flowing earth. The elemental for Irigaray is not a thing, but an interval, maybe more closely, that makes relation possible. The other, whether the other of nature or the other of sexual difference, is encountered in this interval, the space of relation. The elemental assists the cultivation of the self, who can then blossom into a communion with the world and with the other. Part 4. The elemental sustains an interval of desire. The cultivation of such an interval resonates with the structure of desire, whose operations Anne Carson traces in Eros the Bittersweet, a desire traced not just in the body, but also in the structure of triangulation that it institutes and which is as much about objects, letters, and instruments as it is about human bodies. Carson describes the ruse of inserting a third term, a rival, a letter, or an instrument, between lover and beloved, making the space of desire visible. Desire for her is a reaching that operates through the edges of things, through the gaps between presence and absence. The lover wants what he does not have. As soon as it is had, it is no longer wanting. This dilemma is not a failure of desire, but its constitutive structure. Desire is the movement of reaching across the interval between what is present and what is absent. Carson's account also reveals that these boundaries are not merely human. The Greek alphabet, with its invention of consonants, is also an instrument that institutes desire. Consonants mark the edges of sound, she writes. As Eros insists upon the edges of human beings and of the spaces between them, the written consonant imposes edge on the sounds of human speech and insists on the reality of that edge. Can we then think of the tower as a body that creates an interval of desire similar to the alphabet, to the lovers and the elements? Intervals both between self and other and between self and nature, perhaps. The constellation of Ser, Carson, and Irigaray lets us answer this question tentatively. The instrument, as Ser insists, has its own agency. The gnomon is not passive. Its shadow draws an edge across the threshold of visibility, and on Carson's account, desire operates as a movement across exactly such a threshold. The gnomon, in other words, already has the structure that Carson identifies. It is the third term that triangulates sun and observer, sky and ground, present and absence. The Tower of the Winds, read through this constellation, generates both knowledge and the conditions for desire. Its operations are mechanically alike to the structure that Carson describes. A moving term held against a fixed one, so that a gap becomes legible. The gnomon's shadow only means anything because it is read against the circle bisected into four. The float only registers time because it rises against the fixed wall of its cylinder. The bronze disc only simulates the heavens because it turns within a frame that does not turn with it. In each case, one term moves, one term holds still, and the distance between them is what the instrument exists to register. Part 5. Pneumatic entanglements. Holding the two analogies together lets us test what architecture as an art of elemental cultivation might promise. I want to open three possibilities following loose Irigaray for what is at stake at the threshold of a new age. A changed relation between space and time, a changed practice of inhabiting places and the envelopes that contain identity, and a changed relation between matter and form. The first, space and time, is already present in the tower. The winds and the sun transform the tower from a mere building into a model that connects space, time, and natural forces. It orients space. But the tower is also an embodiment of time, the shadow of the gnomon, the flow of water, the rotation of the celestial disk. And it is also a building that allows for both a gap and a momentary entanglement between space and time, an interval in which time can be measured by space and space can be measured by time. Time itself becomes space, and space becomes time, and as such constitute a dwelling space in which to stay. The second possibility, a changed practice of inhabiting places and envelopes. If architecture is an interval that opens a gap between self and world, then inhabitation is a practice of dwelling in what Irigaray calls the hollow space for dwelling, in oneself and outside of oneself. The Tower of the Winds, as a building that performs elementally, is a place where the distinction between inside and outside, self and world, body and environment is put into question by constant shifts and mobilities. The elements that architecture mediates, air, light, water, are not just environmental parameters, but mediums of encounter, the primordial intervals that make relation possible, as Irigaray suggests. And yet these intervals are far from static. The elements ensure their mobility, their loss of fixed reference. The tower, as a polytopic node, in Serre's language, inhabits multiple spaces at once: astronomy, hydraulics, geometry, meteorology, without reducing them to a single meaning. For both thinkers, dwelling is not a matter of being positioned within a stable container, but of being traversed by relations that refuse to center themselves in a single here or now. This dwelling is sustained by air, by breath, the element through which, as Irigaray writes, body and soul are not opposed but continuous. As Serre reminds us, I am endlessly here and elsewhere. I am not a point fixed here and now. I inhabit a multiplicity of spaces. I live a multiplicity of times, always other and always the same. Breath allows for mobility and stasis. The third possibility, a changed relation between matter and form. Both Irigaray and Serre depart from the Western tradition of imposing external form upon passive matter. Irigaray insists form should arise from within, an efflorescence sustained by relation and cultivation, not molded by a solitary act of making. What if form is not imposed but rather emerges, asks Irigaray, a form that blossoms topologically, a dynamic structure of transport and interference that emerges both from within and from without. The Tower of the Winds performs this entanglement materially and formally. Its gnomon does not trace a pre-given figure but lets form emerge through the encounter of sun, shaft, and marble. Its water clock translates variable time into rotational movement. Its celestial disk executes a stereographic projection on its walls. Its wind vane translates the direction of the wind into rotation. A letting be allows for the emergence of a vortex where form and matter marry. Part 6. Architecture triangulated. The Tower of the Winds stands in the Roman Agora of Athens as a modest octagonal marble tower that has survived for over 2,000 years. It is a building which, as an instrument, generates cosmological knowledge through its geometry, its hydraulics, and its astronomical displays. But it is also a building that, read through the lens of Irigaray's elemental philosophy, opens a gap, an interval in which self and world, body and environment, matter and form can encounter one another. And it is a building that, read through Serre's insistence on material agency, operates relentlessly, independently of human intention, generating knowledge operationally and performatively. And it is a building that, read through Carson's triangulation of desire, institutes the edges and intervals that make desire possible. The analogy between the tower and the elements exposes the promise of an elemental poetics in architecture, that architecture can be a form of knowledge, not just a building, that the elements can be mediums of encounter, not just environmental parameters, that the interval between self and world or self and other can be a site of becoming, not just a gap to be filled, that the material can have its own agency, operating relentlessly to generate knowledge, and that desire can be structured through objects, instruments, and letters, not just human bodies. Architecture becomes elemental not when it manages its elements as parameters of comfort and shelter, but primarily when it operates as a gnomon that has the capacity to cultivate thinking in this displaced sense, to construct, to dwell, and to sustain the conditions of desire. Architecture then becomes both a form of knowledge and a poetic structure that promotes a theme in the sense of Irigaray. A here, elsewhere, a mobile site of relations and nuptials in which the elements, the other, the self, and the cosmos circulate without being reduced to a single reference, sustaining the intervals through which encounter and becoming remain possible. Thank you very much.